April 9, 1942. Mariveles, Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. Dawn broke over the jungles of Bataan with an eerie silence. For 99 days, American and Filipino forces had held this narrow peninsula against the full might of Japan's 14th Army, enduring relentless bombardment, dwindling rations, and tropical disease. Now, on this Thursday morning, Major General Edward King stood before Japanese officers to surrender approximately 76,000 Filipino and American troops, the largest capitulation in United States military history. King, gaunt and exhausted, knew his men were in no condition to continue fighting. What none of them knew was that surrender would not bring relief, but rather the beginning of a nightmare journey that would claim thousands of lives over the next week. Among those awaiting their fate was Corporal Lester Tenney, a 22-year-old tank driver from Chicago. Private Leon Beck, a Texan with the 31st Infantry, stood with Filipino soldiers who had become his brothers in arms. Captain William Dias, an Army Air Corps pilot, wondered what would become of the mixed force of American servicemen and Philippine scouts who had fought so courageously together. These men, already weakened by months of half rations and malaria, were about to be forced on a 65-mile march under conditions that would violate every principle of the Geneva Convention, a march that would become known as one of the Pacific War's most notorious atrocities. United States Army Military History Institute, Bataan Surrender, 1942. The Japanese commander overseeing operations in the Philippines was Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, a 54-year-old career officer who had served as a military observer with British forces during World War I and briefly as military attaché in London. Homma was considered one of the more moderate and Anglophile officers in the Imperial Japanese Army, but his command would be forever stained by what occurred on the roads of Bataan in April 1942. Years later, he would face a military tribunal claiming he had not ordered the brutality. But as commander, he bore responsibility for what his subordinates permitted and perpetrated. National Archives, Records of the U.S. Army War Crimes Trials, Sign 46. To understand the Bataan Death March, we must return to December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese bombers struck American air bases in the Philippines, destroying much of General Douglas MacArthur's air power on the ground. Within days, Japanese invasion forces landed at multiple points on Luzon, the Philippines' main island. General Homma's 14th Army, numbering approximately 43,000 troops, began a two-pronged assault designed to capture Manila within 50 days. MacArthur, commanding U.S. Army forces in the Far East, activated War Plan Orange 3, a strategic withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. The plan was sound in theory: hold out until reinforcements arrived from the United States. But in practice, it faced insurmountable problems. The planned supply depots in Bataan had never been fully stocked. When MacArthur ordered the retreat on December 23rd, he pulled back not just the 31,000 troops of the Philippine Division and the Philippine Scouts, but also the entire population of Manila's military district. Approximately 26,000 civilian refugees followed the army into Bataan. Compounding the supply crisis, Morton, The Fall of the Philippines, U.S. Army Center of Military History, 1953. By January 1942, the defenders of Bataan were already on half rations. By March, they were at quarter rations, roughly 1,000 calories per day for men engaged in combat operations. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and dengue fever swept through the ranks. The tropical jungle, thick and oppressive, became an ally to neither side, but the defenders suffered more because they lacked quinine and proper medical supplies. American and Filipino soldiers dubbed themselves the battling bastards of Bataan, darkly joking, "No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam." Diary of Major General Edward King, Philippine Archives. From the Japanese High Command's viewpoint, Bataan was a frustrating failure. General Homma had promised Tokyo a quick victory, 50 days to secure all of Luzon. Instead, his forces became bogged down in brutal jungle fighting against an enemy that refused to collapse. The defenders' courage and tenacity surprised Japanese planners, who had been taught to believe Western troops would not fight tenaciously in Asia. By late March 1942, Homma faced mounting pressure from Imperial General Headquarters. The original invasion timetable had assumed the Philippines would fall quickly, freeing forces for operations elsewhere in the Pacific. Instead, 2 Japanese divisions remained tied down. Tokyo sent reinforcements, heavy artillery, and a new wave of air attacks. More ominously, they also sent staff officers to observe and report on Homma's performance, a professional humiliation suggesting Tokyo doubted his competence. Among these staff officers was Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, an influential and fanatical member of the operations section at Imperial Headquarters. Tsuji had earned a reputation for ruthlessness during operations in Malaya and Singapore, where Japanese forces had committed the Alexandra Hospital massacre and other atrocities against Allied prisoners and Chinese civilians. His presence in the Philippines boded ill for any prisoners who might be taken. Drea. In the Service of the Emperor, 1998. The Imperial Japanese Army's attitude toward prisoners was shaped by the Bushido Code as interpreted through militarist ideology. The 1941 Instructions for the Battlefield Manual stated, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind you." This philosophy, drilled into Japanese soldiers, created profound contempt for anyone who surrendered. In the Japanese military culture of the time, surrender was the ultimate dishonor, worse than death. This ideological framework would have catastrophic consequences for the men who surrendered at Bataan, Japanese Army Field Service Code 41. On April 3, 1942, Japanese forces launched Good Friday Offensive, a massive assault spearheaded by fresh troops, heavy artillery, and constant air bombardment. The American Filipino defensive line, held by men already at the breaking point physically and psychologically, began to crumble. Units that had fought magnificently for 3 months simply had nothing left. On April 7th, Japanese forces broke through near Mount Samet, creating a gap that could not be sealed. General King, commander of the Luzon force on Bataan, faced an impossible situation. General Wainwright, who had assumed overall command when MacArthur was ordered to Australia in March, was on Corregidor and out of direct contact. King's men were starving, disease-ridden, and out of ammunition. Continued resistance would mean annihilation. Against his orders, technically making his action mutiny, King decided to surrender to spare his men from total destruction. At dawn on April 9th, King met Japanese Colonel Motu Nakayama at the Lamao River. King offered his saber in surrender, a gesture Nakayama refused, as King was not the supreme commander. King requested assurances that his men would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The Japanese response was vague. In truth, the Japanese had made virtually no preparations for handling such a large number of prisoners. They had expected perhaps 25,000 captives. Instead, they faced 76,000, 66,000 Filipinos and 10,000 Americans, most already in weakened condition. King testimony. Congressional hearings 1946. The logistical nightmare nobody planned. For the Japanese 14th Army had not anticipated taking so many prisoners, and their logistics were strained. The original plan was to march prisoners approximately 65 miles from Mariveles, at the southern tip of Bataan, to San Fernando, Pampanga, where they would board trains for the final leg to Camp O'Donnell, a Philippine Army training facility hastily converted into a POW camp. The march would traverse 2 distinct routes, one along the main East Road, another along the coast, both narrow roads built for civilian traffic, not military movement. The Japanese themselves were in the midst of moving combat troops, artillery and supplies forward for the assault on Corregidor, creating massive congestion on these same roads. Supply dumps were scattered and inadequate. The Japanese army operated on the principle that soldiers should live off the land, a policy catastrophic when extended to prisoners in an area already stripped of resources by months of combat. Most critically, the Japanese made no provision for food, water, medical care, or transportation for the prisoners. There were no organized rest stops, no field hospitals, no water distribution points. The attitude of the Japanese command ranged from indifference to active malice. To many Japanese soldiers, these prisoners were contemptible for having surrendered and were barely deserving of the effort to keep them alive. On the morning of April 10th, The first groups of prisoners began moving north from Mariveles. The organization, if it could be called that, was chaotic. Men were separated from their units. Officers were sometimes separated from enlisted men. Filipinos and Americans were intermixed. Japanese guards, many themselves exhausted from the campaign, herded thousands of prisoners onto roads already clogged with military traffic. Captain William Dias, who would later escape and provide detailed testimony, described the initial hours. The Japs began to come for us shortly after daylight. We were formed in columns of fours. Between 60 and 80 men of various nationalities made up each group. We were counted and then marched out. No food was issued. We were told nothing of our destination. Dias, the Dias story, 1944. The prisoners were already in desperate condition. Corporal Lester Tenney, who survived the march and later wrote extensively about it, recalled, "We had been on half rations since January, and by April we were eating anything, mules, horses, even monkeys and lizards. Many of us had malaria. Dysentery was universal. Some men had lost 40 or 50 pounds. We were walking skeletons before the march even started." Tenney, My Hitch in Hell, 1995. The tropical heat was overwhelming. April is summer in the Philippines, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity approaching saturation. The prisoners, many already dehydrated and feverish, were given no water. Japanese soldiers themselves carried only small canteens, and they showed no inclination to share. Artesian wells and streams dotted the route, but prisoners were beaten or shot if they broke ranks to drink. Within hours, a pattern of systematic cruelty emerged that would define the march. The brutality fell into several categories, documented by multiple survivors, whose accounts corroborate each other with horrifying consistency. First was the sun treatment, a torture that combined dehydration, heat exhaustion, and psychological torment. Guards would force men to sit in open fields or on the roadside in direct sunlight, sometimes for hours, without water or shade. Men already weakened by disease and starvation would quickly develop heat stroke. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who could not rise were bayoneted or shot. Private Leon Beck described watching men just start babbling, lose their minds from the heat and thirst, and then they'd fall over dead. Beck Oral History, National W.P. Museum, 1983. Second was the systematic denial of food and water. For the entire march, which took most prisoners between 5 and 10 days depending on when they started, prisoners received virtually no food from their captors. Some Filipino civilians, at great personal risk, threw food to prisoners or left it by the roadside. Japanese guards often beat these civilians or destroyed the food. Water was available from streams and artesian wells along the route, but prisoners were frequently prevented from drinking or allowed only seconds to drink before being driven forward. Third was the treatment of those who fell behind. The column of prisoners stretched for miles, and the pace was brutal, often covering 12 to 20 miles per day under the blazing sun. Men who fell from exhaustion, dysentery, or heat stroke were routinely bayoneted, shot, or simply left by the roadside. Japanese supply trucks, tanks, and artillery units moving forward to attack Corregidor would deliberately run over prisoners lying in the road. Sergeant Paul Kircham testified, "I saw a soldier fall. A Jap guard kicked him in the head, then bayoneted him. When he still moved, the guard shot him. This was not unusual. I saw it happen dozens of times." Kircham Affidavit, War Crimes Trials, 1946. Fourth was random brutality, beatings for no apparent reason or for trivial offenses. Men were beaten for having Japanese souvenirs in their pockets, for wearing Japanese-style canteens, for looking at a guard, or for no reason at all. Captain Ralph Hibbs, a medical officer, documented systematic beatings with rifle butts, bamboo clubs, and fists. The Japanese seemed to particularly enjoy beating men who were already down. It was as if they wanted to demonstrate their complete power over us, Hibbs' testimony. 1946. Among the many atrocities of the march, the Pantingan River Massacre stands as one of the most calculated and cold-blooded. On approximately April 12th, Japanese guards separated between 350 and 400 Filipino officers from the main prisoner column near the Pantingan River in the municipality of Hermosa. The officers, who included majors, captains, and lieutenants of the Philippine Army and Philippine Scouts, were told they would be transported separately. Instead, they were marched to a ravine near the river, forced to their knees, and systematically executed, most by beheading, some by bayonet, others shot. The massacre took hours. Survivors, few in number, reported that some men were forced to dig graves for those killed earlier. Japanese soldiers treated the mass execution as routine, even jovial, with some taking photographs. Bodies were left in shallow graves, or simply dumped in the ravine. Philippine War Crimes Commission findings, 1947. The motive for targeting Filipino officers specifically reflects Japanese strategic concerns. The Japanese occupation government sought to establish control over the Philippines and viewed Filipino military officers as potential resistance leaders. Eliminating them served both vengeance and perceived security interests. The massacre was not spontaneous violence, but a deliberate policy decision, making it a war crime of particular gravity under international law. Witness accounts. The human reality, the prisoners who survived, left detailed testimony that brings the march's horror into sharp focus. These were not abstract statistics, but individual human beings watching their comrades die. Corporal Lester Tenney recalled a friend named Sammy. He was a kid from Brooklyn, maybe 20 years old. He got dysentery so bad he couldn't control himself. The smell, the shame, it broke him mentally before his body gave out. He kept apologizing, saying, I'm sorry. When he couldn't walk anymore, a guard bayoneted him. He died calling for his mother. Tenney memoir, Sci-5 Major William Bianchi, who survived by pretending to be dead after a beating. Described the psychology of the guards. Some seemed to enjoy the cruelty. They smiled when they beat us. Others looked indifferent, as if we weren't human beings at all, just cargo they had to move. Very few showed something like pity, but they never intervened. Bianchi Oral History, 1980. Lieutenant Colonel William Chandler documented the systematic nature of the atrocities. This was not discipline that got out of hand. This was policy. The brutality was too consistent, too widespread, happening simultaneously along the entire route. The guards had been given no orders to protect us or provide for us. At best, they were indifferent to whether we lived or died. At worst, they actively sought to kill us. Chandler Testimony, Manila Tribunal, 1946. Filipino prisoners faced additional burdens. Many spoke no English and could not communicate with American prisoners. The Japanese guards, many of whom viewed Filipinos as racially inferior colonial subjects, often treated them with even greater brutality than they showed Americans. Yet Filipino civilians along the route took enormous risks to help prisoners. Women would leave rice balls by the road. Children would sneak water containers near the columns. Old men would bow in respect as prisoners passed. When Japanese guards caught them, these civilians were beaten or arrested. Survival often came down to small mercies and desperate measures. Prisoners learned to drink from carabao wallows, muddy water buffalo pools that would normally cause dysentery, but at least prevented immediate death from dehydration. They ate sugarcane from fields when guards weren't watching. They supported each other physically, with stronger men carrying weapons or packs for weaker ones, or literally holding up comrades who could barely walk. Some guards showed flickers of humanity. A few allowed brief water stops. One guard, name unknown, was reported to have looked away when prisoners grabbed food left by civilians. But these exceptions were rare and unpredictable. Most prisoners learned to expect nothing but cruelty, and to be grateful for mere indifference. The march also revealed extraordinary courage. Medical officers, themselves sick and weakened, continued trying to care for fellow prisoners, despite having no supplies. Chaplains, including Father Albert Braun, provided last rites and comfort to dying men, while facing the same dangers. Junior officers organized prisoners into mutual support groups, sharing whatever they had. These acts of solidarity, small as they might seem against the overwhelming horror, represented the prisoners' refusal to surrender, their humanity, even as their bodies failed. Those who survived the march arrived at Camp O'Donnell between mid-April and early May, 1942. What they found was hardly better than the march itself. The camp, a former Philippine Army training facility, was completely unprepared to house 50,000 prisoners. Some had died on the march, others were held at different locations. There were inadequate barracks, one working water spigot for the entire camp, no medical facilities, and almost no food. Camp O'Donnell became a death camp not through gas chambers or execution walls, but through deliberate neglect and starvation. The Japanese commandant, Captain Yoshio Tsuneyoshi, made clear in his welcoming speech that prisoners were not honorable POWs, but cowards who deserved no consideration. Men continued to die by the hundreds, from dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and simple starvation. In the first 2 months of the camp's operation, approximately 500 Americans and 20,000 Filipinos died. United States Army reports, 1945. Later, conditions marginally improved when prisoners were transferred to other camps like Cabanatuan, where organized resistance, secret gardens, and slightly better rations reduced the death rate. But the damage of Bataan and O'Donnell left permanent scars. Those who survived would face years more imprisonment, many eventually transported to Japan, Korea, or Manchuria as slave labor. Of the approximately 10,000 Americans captured at Bataan, only about 4,000 survived to liberation in 1945. Determining the exact death toll of the Bataan Death March itself, separate from the battles before and imprisonment after, remains difficult. The march was chaos. Record-keeping was non-existent. Bodies were left along the roadside and in mass graves. Post-war investigations and survivor testimony provide estimates rather than precise numbers. For American prisoners, estimates range from 500 to 650 deaths during the march itself. For Filipino prisoners, estimates range from 5,000 to 18,000 deaths. The wide range reflects the incomplete records and the fact that many Filipino soldiers, once in the prison camps, were eventually released because the Japanese decided they weren't threats, making it difficult to track who died on the march versus in the camps. What is certain is that thousands of men who survived the Battle of Bataan died during or immediately after the march due to the brutal conditions and deliberate cruelty of their captors, U.S. Army Adjutant. General casualty records, 1946, when American forces returned to the Philippines in October 1944, one of their priorities was liberating POW camps. On January 30, 1945, U.S. Army Rangers and Filipino guerrillas executed a daring raid on Cabanatuan prison camp, liberating 511 surviving prisoners, many of them Bataan survivors. On February 3rd, paratroopers liberated Los Baños internment camp. As Manila fell in March 1945, more camps were overrun and liberated. The survivors who emerged were skeletal figures, many weighing less than 90 pounds, suffering from multiple tropical diseases, and psychologically traumatized. But they could finally tell their stories. Captain William Dias had actually escaped from a work detail in 1943, made his way through Japanese lines with the help of Filipino guerrillas, and reached Australia. His testimony, published in January 1944, provided the first detailed account of the march and shocked the American public. The U.S. government had initially suppressed his account, fearing it would inflame public opinion and endanger prisoners still in Japanese hands. Once published, it confirmed the worst fears about Japanese treatment of POWs. Dias, The Dias Story, Chicago Tribune, 1944. In late 1945, the United States Army established military commissions in Manila to try Japanese officers for war crimes committed in the Philippines. The commission trying General Masaharu Homma convened in January 1946. Homma faced charges including the Bataan Death March, the rape and massacre of Manila, and other atrocities. The prosecution presented devastating testimony from survivors. They described the march in detail: the beatings, the sun treatment, the denial of food and water, the casual murders. They presented evidence that Homma, as commanding general, must have known about the treatment of prisoners given the scale and duration of the atrocities. Medical officers testified about the conditions and death rates. Homma's defense argued that the general had not ordered brutality, that he was unaware of the full extent of the suffering, and that logistical difficulties rather than malice explained the lack of provisions. They pointed out that Homma had been preoccupied with the assault on Corregidor and had delegated POW administration to subordinates. Character witnesses, including British officers who had known Homma before the war, testified to his moderate reputation and relatively humane track record. The Commission, however, applied the principle of command responsibility established at the Nuremberg trials. A commander is responsible for the actions of troops under his command. The prosecution argued that the atrocities were too widespread, too systematic, and too obvious for Homma to have been ignorant. Even if he had not ordered brutality, he had failed to prevent it, failed to punish perpetrators, and failed to provide basic necessities required under international law. United Nations War Crimes Commission. Law Reports of Trials of War Criminals, Volume 4, 1948. On February 11, 1946, the tribunal found Homma guilty. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. On April 3, 1946, almost exactly 4 years after he launched the final assault on Bataan, General Massacre Homma was executed outside Manila. Before his execution, he expressed remorse for the suffering of prisoners, while maintaining he had not ordered the brutality. His last words were reported to be a poem, reflecting on the impermanence of life. Execution Records, U.S. Army JAG Files, 1946. Other officers faced justice as well. Captain Yoshio Tsuneyoshi, Commandant of Camp O'Donnell, was tried and executed. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, however, escaped justice. One of the most brutal and fanatical officers in the Japanese army, implicated in atrocities from Singapore to the Philippines, Tsuji went into hiding after the war. He eventually resurfaced in Japan, entered politics, and served in the Diet until his mysterious disappearance in Laos in 1961. He never faced trial for his war crimes. Drea, Nomenhan, 2009. For decades after the war, American survivors of the Bataan Death March felt their sacrifice had been forgotten. While European theater veterans were celebrated, Pacific War veterans often felt ignored. The fall of Bataan had been portrayed during the war as a defeat, and survivors sometimes faced questions about why they had surrendered rather than fight to the death. This began to change in the 1980s and 1990s as veterans organizations and historians worked to recognize the Bataan defenders' courage. In 1987, the U.S. Congress authorized a memorial in New Mexico, where many of the Bataan defenders had been members of the 200th and 515th Coast Artillery Regiments. The Bataan Memorial Death March, an annual endurance marathon held at White Sands Missile Range, New Mexico, now honors their memory, established 1992. In the Philippines, the sacrifice of Filipino soldiers has been commemorated at multiple sites, including markers along the route of the march. April 9th, the date of the Bataan surrender, is observed as Araw ng Kagitingan, Day of Valor in the Philippines, a national holiday honoring Filipino and American soldiers who fought in World War II. The Mount Samat National Shrine in Bataan features a massive cross memorial visible for miles, dedicated to the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, Philippine Veterans Affairs Office. Survivors like Lester Tenney devoted their later years to education and reconciliation. Tenney, who survived not only the march but also years of slave labor in Japanese mines, eventually traveled to Japan, met with former guards, and advocated for official Japanese apologies and compensation. In 2010, at age 90, he received an official apology from the Japanese ambassador to the United States. He continued speaking to schools and military audiences until his death in 2017 at age 96, insisting that his story be remembered not for hatred, but as a warning about the consequences of war. Tenney Foundation Educational Materials. The Bataan Death March teaches multiple enduring lessons. First, it demonstrates that the laws of war exist for profound reasons. The Geneva Convention's requirements that prisoners receive food, water, medical care, and humane treatment are not mere suggestions. They separate civilization from barbarity. When these rules are abandoned, prisoners die by the thousands. Second, it illustrates the danger of military cultures that view surrender as ultimate dishonor. The Japanese military's contempt for anyone who surrendered created a psychological framework that permitted atrocity. Soldiers taught that surrender is worse than death will inevitably brutalize prisoners who have surrendered. Third, the march shows the importance of command responsibility and accountability. General Homma's claim that he didn't know or didn't order the brutality did not absolve him. Commanders must actively ensure humane treatment of prisoners. Indifference or delegation is not a defense. Fourth, The Bataan Death March reminds us of the extraordinary resilience of human beings under impossible conditions. Men who should have died by any medical or statistical measure survived through will, mutual support, and sometimes sheer luck. Their survival and testimony ensured that the truth could not be buried. Finally, the stories of Filipino civilians who risked their lives to help prisoners, and of the bonds between American and Filipino soldiers who fought and suffered together, demonstrate that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity and solidarity persist. In the judgment of the Manila Military Commission, delivered February 11, 1946, the tribunal concluded, the atrocities committed during the march from Bataan, and in the subsequent imprisonment of prisoners of war, were so extensive and so methodical that they constituted a system of terror and brutality. The accused, as commanding general, was responsible for the troops under his command and for ensuring their compliance with the laws of war. Manila Military Commission. Case number 17, 1946. Today, memorials stand in both the United States and the Philippines, honoring the Bataan defenders. At the American Cemetery in Manila, 17,206 graves hold American service members who died in the Pacific War, many of them Bataan survivors who died in prison camps. The Court of the Missing records the names of 36,285 missing in action, many lost in the chaos of Bataan and the camps. Each year, veterans, family members, and military personnel gather at dawn on April 9th at Mount Summit in the Philippines. They climb the long stairway to the memorial cross. Walking a small fraction of the distance the prisoners marched in 1942, they carry photographs of fathers and grandfathers, read names and bow their heads in silence. Corporal Lester Tenney, in one of his final interviews in 2016, said, "I want people to know what happened, not to hate the Japanese, but to understand what war does to human beings. I want them to remember my buddies who didn't make it. They were somebody's son, somebody's brother. They deserved better. We all did." Tenney interview, Veterans History Project, Library of Congress, 2016.